just open it up for general discussion. So, here's my, but let me kick it off with a few remarks about the program itself. So, something is afoot with the forest. Last year, as I was working up a proposal for the Humanities Center on the theme of forests, this sentence came to me, and I haven't been able to shake it or set it aside. Each time I set out to describe this program, I begin with these words: something is afoot with the forest. I don't quite know who or what composed this line, but I'm not sure it was me. It sounds like something I once heard and then forgot entirely and then remembered without a reference. It seems to me like the ghost of someone else's utterance. Whatever the case, once this thought or recollection came to me, it was hard not to notice the following coincidence. Just as forests everywhere are stressed to the breaking point or dying off or burning in the heat and the drought or being burned off to make way for cattle ranches and palm oil plantations, or having their remaining integrity further depleted by clear cuts for cash value, their shades have been gathering in our minds and thoughts, transported by novels, poems, works of photography, exhibitions and artworks, along with untold numbers of websites, nature writings, popular science writings, contemporary spiritual treatises on ancient forest wisdom, and by brilliant documentaries like the one we'll discuss tonight. So the Humanities Center at Texas Tech's annual theme for 2020-2021 is forests, and all this academic year we'll be thinking about forests, what they are, how they work, especially when they're healthy, how we have always lived in their shadow and under their shade, even while we took them for granted, and why their preservation truly matters. We'll also be thinking with forests in order to come to grips with the contemporary state of the biosphere at large, and how we humans, the beneficiaries and consumers of forests, might proceed from here, might learn things from the trees and the forests to make positive differences in face of the ecological challenges we currently confront. So in designing and organizing the forest program, I just want to say how grateful I am for the strong support of the Humanities Center here at Tech, its indefatigable director, Mike Borshuk, for the forest team that he introduced you to, Shankar Chatterjee, Christopher Witmore, Sara Spurgeon, and Curtis Bauer. And I should just mention that we'll be continuing on in the spring. We just haven't put that part of the program together yet. But Curtis and I will be teaming up to curate the events that will, the 2021 events, which will be dedicated to the arts and humanities of trees and forests. Whereas we're starting out, as you can see, with the science of forests, the archaeology and the anthropology of forests, and then the extending then to the indigenous lifeways as they were connected to forests here on the American continent. Okay, so let me now say a few things about this really fine documentary that I hope you all had a chance to look at. I'm assuming that you saw it and are ready to jump into this discussion. So, so I'll make some brief comments about Intelligent Trees, the documentary, and then ask my colleagues to share their own thoughts and responses, and then we'll open it up to a general discussion in which you're all invited to participate. So Intelligent Trees introduces us to a Canadian scientist and a German forest ranger both of whom have become prominent voices in the recent discussion of forests, which is truly an international discussion. And this is on everybody's radar. Now, both of these figures are former foresters. That is, they used to work for the timber industry. And both became disillusioned down on the forest plantation, where clear cuts are followed by the planting of monocultures of pine, fir, or spruce, managed with heavy machinery and dosed with the application of insecticides, practices that radically disrupt or wipe out natural or unobtrusively managed forest communities, along with wiping out their species diversity within the plant kingdom and all the salutary animal, fungal, and microbial partners that are part of the forest totality. So one surmises from watching them in this documentary that for both of them, a moment arrived when neither could continue to make the ethical compromises demanded by that job working on the timber plantation. Now, Suzanne Simard went back to the university, got a doctorate, and emerged as a pioneering forest ecologist and experimentalist, making key discoveries leading to our current understanding of what's called the wood wide web. And Peter Wohlleben had the good fortune to find a new job, caring for a nearly intact piece of old beech forest in rural Germany, and some decades later, in 2015, published the first German edition of the internationally acclaimed work, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries from a Secret World. And the English translation followed just a year later. And I imagine it's been translated by now into a number of other languages. Wohleben's book was really instrumental in raising the profile of the discussion of forests. So, how is it that trees may be considered intelligent? I'll touch on just a couple of the reasons for accepting this characterization as they're brought out in the documentary. So the narrator of Intelligent Trees begins by affirming that, just as in our connected society built around the artificial forests we call cities, in actual forests, words, she tells us, are rushing back and forth. Communications are occurring through a natural medium, the wood wide web, we now call it, constituted, as we now know, by mycorrhizal fungi that associate with the entangled root systems of many different tree and plant species in the forest. These connections produce the countless cross-kingdom links and nodes in the wood wide web. And just so you understand the term cross-kingdom, trees are, of course, members of the plant kingdom, but fungi constitute their own biological kingdom, one of the 5 kingdoms if we use the 5-kingdom model, which is highly recommended, but certainly better than the old 2-kingdom model where everything was either a plant or an animal or God knows what, or a rock. Okay, so what's going on in the forest is a multi-kingdom symbiotic consortium. Now, Simard explains, all of the trees were linked after she had, done her scientific investigation of what's going on. She says all of the trees were all linked together in a single massive net. Her scientific research has established that these partnerships that involved in this network are genuine mutualisms. That is to say, they're symbiotic associations that are mutually beneficial for all the symbionts involved. And what so then what are the words that are intelligently spoken over this network? Okay, how do we deal with that metaphor? In the first instance, they are the nutrients, separately collected, tree sap, full of sugars for the fungi, fungal hoardings of precious phosphorus and nitrogen for the trees, and then passed around from fungus to tree, from tree to fungus, and by way of fungus, from tree to tree. Simard goes on, all of these elements actually move back and forth between the trees. And that was this is still Simard, quoted from the documentary, that was the rudimentary understanding of the language of trees. So trees and forests, like microbes and insects, live well through an intelligible organic commerce composed in a language made of chemical elements and compounds, which constitute both the nutrients that keeps everyone healthy and well fed, and at other times the signals that are sent on the Wood Wide Web within the forest to alert the community of various dangers or situations going on. Now, Wohlleben notes that forests are also intelligent in that they're smart enough to shape their environments to their own liking. Clear cutting and other practices that chip away at the integrity of forest societies are damaging, he explains, quote, because, he explains, only together can trees regulate the microclimate and lower the air temperature, because trees love it cool and moist. So if intelligence has to do with the ability to negotiate a social existence for communal benefit, then trees are smart enough to do that. Smart enough. And conversely, Wohlleben continues, quote, for a tree, it is a disaster when the social network collapses, unquote. Because once the social connections upon which each individual tree in a forest relies are snapped, they're too slow growing to be rapidly repaired, leaving that tree vulnerable and exposed. However, when left undisturbed and intact over the centuries and millennia of their own natural time, forests are brilliant at constituting and maintaining their own comfort zone. I'm going to finish up by stepping slightly aside from the terminology of the documentary and introduce another set of terms I hope you'll appreciate. So restating this matter in the scientific idiom of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, this is to say that forests may be thought of as microcosms of Gaia, of the Gaian system, or if you prefer, the Earth system. Here, Gaia is understood, that is in the discourse of Lovelock and Margulis, Gaia is understood as the planetary system that emerges from the totality of living beings and the sum of their environmental modulations to produce and sustain habitable conditions for the current biosphere altogether. For instance, over geological time, Gaia has been doing its best to cool the planet against the ever-increasing luminosity of the sun. Drawing down atmospheric carbon for eons, Gaia has operated to keep the planetary climate comfortably cool. So in this light, forest ecosystems may be considered as Gaian subsystems, each one cooling and humidifying the planetary surface within its own confines, building up complex, diverse, and desirable habitats, but only as long as they're left intact. So the repercussions of the forest's climate maintenance extend far beyond their own borders. As we, and this, an example of that would be the biotic pump that my students have read about in chapter 18 of Wohleben's The Hidden Life of Trees. But maybe we can come back to that. But just to finish up, forests are planet makers in their own right, and their loss would not be just a regional, but a planetary catastrophe in the making. So let's hope we don't lose them all and get them coming back in the ongoing life of this planet. Okay, thank you. Chris, take it away, my friend.
Bruno, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And just as an aside, hailing from North Carolina, where a state that was predominantly agrarian in the 19th century is now a forest state, there are stories of resilience that we'll also be able to talk about in the coming exhibition with Pisgah National Forest. So that's going to be, I think, just to put a little bit of a bright light there in that kind of discussion about the loss of forests, which is so palpable today for all of us. And thank you. I mean, this was a extremely interesting documentary, Intelligent Trees, and we learned quite a bit from it about happenings underground, about relationships between trees that are about more than the trunk and the crown, about communication among trees, about cooperation over competition. And there we may give out a shout out to Lynn Margulis, who has taught us so much about cooperation over a kind of, Darwinian perspective on competition, or should we say neo-Darwinian. We learn about the oneness of the forest, what Samard calls mutualistic facilitating relationships as well. We learn of the hidden life of trees with Wohleben, where trees feel emotion, pain, and fear, where evenly aged trees and managed forests using machinery are kind of out of balance with the perspective that we need to begin to embrace, a need for multiple species living together. As an archaeologist, I'm really interested in, everything that is laid out in the documentary, of course, and I think Bruno covered that extremely well. But there's a parallel perspective that was kind of drawn in alongside the perspectives of both Samard and Wohlebens. And I was really grateful to see that these new scientific perspectives on entangled nature of the forest were situated next to an indigenous worldview. And there we saw, I think, Dr. Teresa Ryan with the Shimshan, who was a Shimshan member, was, also a fisheries and aquatic ecologist. And we learned there more about the oneness of the forest, and, describing and really what indigenous communities are known for a long time. And I think that I'm really excited. I think you said that Lee Klinger is among the guests today, and we'll be speaking later in our forest theme. So I would love to hear more about what he thinks on this. But, for me, I have read quite a bit of ethnographies of the region, and one that jumps out at me immediately is, of course, Make Prayers to the Raven, which was done by Richard K. Nielsen, who wrote, and we might listen alongside Richard K. Nielsen as he did, to the Koyokan, who talked and spoke about a sentient forest where soils, rivers, trees to the north, where everything has life in it, where animals, plants, the earth, landforms, the air, weather, the sky are all spiritually invested. And so you see, the Koyokan understood their surroundings to be aware, to feel, and to be offended. And thus there was, that kind of perspective demanded that the forest was at every single moment treated with respect. Now, this kind of spiritually entangled reality of the Koyokan was in many ways analogous to how the movie urged us to understand interactions and relatedness of trees through mutualism underground, fungal networks underground, communicating and sharing carbon, passing kind of communication through them. And of course, for the Koyokan, the ever watchful forest was not tied to happenings underground with a subterranean kind of rhizosphere. It was really about the power, for example, of the spruce. It was concentrated in the boughs, the bough of the tree, and then up to the top, into the crown. And so the invisible world for them, rather than what we're talking about in terms of what lies underground in this chthonic domain of the subterranean, was really kind of there in a spiritual sense, right? It happened in a way for them that was not visible. In many ways, the way in which science is itself making explicit this kind of underground world. But for them too, the spiritual world was one that had this kind of revelatory kind of relationship that required a shamanistic presence to understand these kind of the spiritual realm. And yet, in so many ways, there are striking similarities in the perspectives. Almost the fact that this blindness, this kind of experiential blindness we have, has kind of been there in the forest the whole time. We just have chosen not to listen to it. We've chosen not to listen to the trees, and we've chosen not to listen to the indigenous communities that have actually, in many ways, had an incredible perspective on these forests for some time. And, you know, so these linkages in the spiritual sense, there is mothering in the Coyoacan forest. There's a sheltering haven for all forest creatures, not only human, but all creatures are linked together in this Coyoacan view. And this is another kind of attribute of the movie that I feel, you know, it's almost like we get into the specialism of sciences, that we have the blinders on to the kind of wider realm of the ecology with the other animals and other creatures that share these lands and these forests with us, besides the kind of heavy humans with their wheels that are driving around and compacting everything. So something's afoot. Needs to be, rather than on wheels, we need someone to be actually be on foot or on the hoof, as they show, because as an archaeologist, bringing in kind of companion animals to help, you know, selectively cut a forest is actually a wonderful idea. And it's something that's actually beginning to happen again in North Carolina forests. I have a friend right now that has a company that does just that with a team of mules. So for the Coyoacan, there is this kind of sheltering haven that's inclusive, and you shield the trees in the forest, shield them from the bitter cold. Of course, it's a localized perspective. And this is really one of the great challenges that Bruce has kind of presented us with, is this kind of middle ground between locality, the regrounding that we get by thinking about Coyoacan perspectives and the kind of perspective that comes out of the movie, and a planetary perspective. How do we create a grounded planetary perspective? Because it is the case that we could either turn deep back into locality and talk about this ground to the exclusion of everything else. And of course, in this country, as so many of you know, there's a blindness to what came here before. So it's a wonderful thing that Mike does with every single kind of, you know, with the Humanities Center's events, to actually give that respect to the Comanche Nation. But the sheltering forest, and a recognition that in many ways for the Coyoacan, it was the oldest trees. It was the old white spruces, the greatest, the tallest ones that had the most power. Their spirits were by far the most powerful for the Coyoacan. The parallels, in fact, when you begin to delve into a book like Make Prayers to the Raven, and for those of you at Texas Tech, do not call this book back. I have it. You have to order it through Interlibrary Loan. But you do see, I think, a really incredible, you can begin to form a lot of incredible connections here with these indigenous cultures. And this large old spruce would actually protect those who slept or slumbered beneath it, whether they were humans or other animals. Now, I am, again, excited to see Lee Klinger amongst the speakers, because in my work, I've been invited by a local community in North Carolina to actually begin to do some archaeology of the forest. I'm from North Carolina, it's my home, so I know a lot of these communities and these peoples. And from the North Carolina perspective now, moving from the West, which is caught up with these fires, and there's a lot of controversy about the issue of management. And management is something that often becomes visible when it's lacking, but that also depends on who's looking. And, you know, Native communities throughout the Americas undertook prescribed fires for quite some time. I mean, we're talking, these are things you measure in millennia when you begin to really think about it. And those controlled burns, at least in a North Carolina sense, were something that are about opening visibility. They're about encouraging the growth of grasses, but it was also something that served to attract elk, bison, and deer. And of course, there is something of a kind of experiential relationship with these animals that a lot of these communities survive on. And there's something that, you know, the beauty of this movie, the beauty of science, is that it pulls us to begin to look at, you know, really living things that are, shall we say, often overlooked, such as fungi. But with that, this perspective of the Native American, the indigenous, is something that I feel that is important. I'm very glad it was there, but we can make a lot more of it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sara.
Thanks, Christopher. Hi, everybody. I also was delighted with this documentary. I thought it was really fascinating. I would like to draw our attention to the language and the metaphors that our two main hosts for that documentary used to talk about the trees, but not just the trees, the forest, by which, of course, they refer to not only the trees, but the mosses, the fungi, the birds, the insects, and as Bruce says, what is sometimes called the wood wide web. And they frequently used what seems like an anthropocentric way of talking about the relationships that they were trying to understand through science. They had mother trees and grandfather trees. They had babies and children. They worked very hard to try to find a language to talk about those relationships. And in landing on the language of families as they did, I think it makes some viewers, especially perhaps Euro-Western viewers, a bit uncomfortable to hear this anthropocentric language and metaphor applied to something like a tree or a forest. But following up on what Chris said, I'd like to ask us to sort of think about those relationships through a different kind of lens. There is a well-known and often repeated story about Euro-American scholar who is accompanying a native Hawaiian elder on a sort of guided walk on a beach in Hawaii. At one point, the Hawaiian elder remarks on how the rocks today have decided to welcome them to their place and even to accompany them and go along with them. The Euro-Western scholar says, you know, excuse me, but isn't that being a little anthropocentric to assume that rocks have feelings and emotions? To which the native elder replied, isn't it anthropocentric of you to assume they don't? So this sort of shift in the way we think about not just what or whom might have emotions and relationships also can, I think, help us to think about the potential ways of considering relationships outside of the narrow way that Euro-Western worldviews teach us. So Bruno had talked initially as well about the idea of exchange, making a kind of economy in the forest, especially for the indigenous nations of the Pacific Northwest, which are deeply forest-embedded nations. That idea is expressed as reciprocity, right? And that reciprocity, not what rights you have, but what you owe to others is not just how you define your family relationships, your kinship with other people in your community. It's also how you define your kinship with things that are not human, what you owe as a form of reciprocity to those other kingdoms to which humans don't belong, and yet with whom we can still have a deep sense of community. And if we are willing to follow the teachings of what Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon terms indigenous science, then we can have a reciprocal kinship relationship with something much larger than just another handful of humans. And I feel like even if they did not approach it directly in that way, that sort of rethinking of what reciprocity means and what kinship means was part of what our two main speakers in that documentary were asking us to think about, to really expand how we position ourselves in relation to those other four kingdoms, all of which are in play in that forest, right? So that we become a reciprocal part of it, not just a scientist there examining it and attempting to take samples from the roots and soil, not just a logger figuring out how many trees can be cut without that being too many trees, but also asking what we owe to that forest, and in a larger sense, what we owe to the whole planet, right? Which in some ways brings us back to the Gaia principle. So I will keep my talk short and sweet and pass the baton to Curtis Bauer.
Great. Well, thank you. I mean, all of these discussions have been fantastic, and I think that it's interesting that the poet and translator comes at the end, the shortest amount of time. Always the short shrift for the poet. But I'm joking. No, but I think that I feel like my role in this group is also to complicate some things. I mean, we're all talking about metaphor, and we're all talking about the figurative sense. But I, as a poet and as a translator, I'm living in that realm pretty much constantly, and that's been my reaction to this documentary. What I was immediately drawn to, I mean, an image that sticks in my head is of that planned forest, of the farm, the tree farm, where all of the trees are in perfect symmetry with each other. And the narrators are talking about how in that forest there is no it's like there's no mother tree, or there's no tree that is sharing experience or sharing knowledge. All of them are individuals, but it's this large, vast forest. And I think about how that parallels contemporary society, the solitude that we have in this larger collective. We're living in cities. This is how the documentary begins, right? We're living in this city, but we're all individuals. We're all alone, and we're all separated from each other. And what are those ties that bring us together? So, kind of going from what Sara was talking about with that language and metaphor, I'm drawn to how they're talking about the language being passed down, knowledge being passed down from these older trees to the younger ones, but how that's broken off when the economy or the business of farming trees, that isn't a concern. So I automatically think the humanity of the forest, right? The humanity of this process isn't a concern. It's more of the business, the economy of, I'm going to grow them, slash them down, harvest, and then plant new ones, and not taking into consideration that kind of the life that surrounds this, which, I think if you kind of go back to all of our different podcasts, all of us are talking about these same things. But in mine, I mentioned the fact that I'm translating the Spanish writer who is thinking about rural communities. And in one particular area, she talks about the cork oak. And Bruno, you'd mentioned something at the beginning about the shade of these trees. You're right. What is in the shade? And this writer, Maria Sanchez, talks about how the shade is something that we can't take away. We can't grab it and put it in our pockets or put it in a scrapbook. It's something that comes from this living thing, this living being. And she then goes on to talk about what we can learn from these trees and what we can learn from sitting in the shade of those trees. And to think about what we can learn, what I've drawn away from this documentary, making these connections to how important it is for us to be in a group, to be in a kind of collective like this. We've got this Humanities Center that is bringing these ideas together and allowing for these different species, let's call them, to share these ideas and share our nutrients. And I think that's the real value of this particular group and of this idea. And so I think we want to have some time for questions here. So and I don't know if it's my right to do this or not, but because I'm the poet, I can do it, right? But to just kind of complicate this idea of thinking of, here we are in West Texas, and where is this magnificent forest that we're all conceiving, that we saw in these documentaries? Where is that forest that's here? And I think I think we can talk about that metaphorically, figuratively, but this crowd or this group, we've got a lot to say about that. So I'll turn it back to this group to kind of carry on that discussion, and maybe some questions from our audience as well.
Hey, well, let me just pick it up. Thanks, Curtis, Sarah, Chris. Wonderful, evocative commentaries. I note that our friend Shankar has joined us. We weren't sure that you were going to be able to make it tonight, but here you are in our little grove on the Zoom. Shankar, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. I'll touch two topics I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I'll talk, mainly from evolutionary point of view. Now, one thing about us, we human beings, we call ourselves Homo sapiens, means wise man. My question is, are we wise? Because if we look at our tenure, for 7 million years, we are in this planet, starting from Sahelanthropus to today. Most of the time, almost 6.7, most of the time of our tenure, we spent in the forest. We are really the hunter and gatherer. We came to the open land only 12,000 years ago. And suddenly we changed everything. We started agriculture, we then built cities, and now we're destroying. So think about it. These forests gave us shelter for all of our life. Now we have become the enemies. So that's very ironic. Second part is about the tree. As I said, I didn't watch that documentary, and I will. So Bruce is going to send it to me. But from perspective, you talked about fungi and tree, the symbiotic relationship. So this is underground, subterranean. And this is really Margulissian, okay? This is typical Margulis ideas. If you come to the main tree, we see a more Darwinian. So when the first tree, when the plants came to the land, along with plant, two groups came. One is of course fungi, the other is insect. Before that insects were living on water. So when the plants started growing, they found a ready source of food, that is the leaves. And for millions of years, there was a fight between the insects and the plants. Why the plants developed thorn? Why they developed poison? Why they developed all these drugs to deter, those who eat their plants. Okay, so there's a strong competition going on between, plants and the plant eaters. And plant, they are very equipped. Then what happened? There is a truce. When the flowers started blooming, plant invited insect for the first time. Think about it. They invented fly trap and others just to grab, kill. I mean, can you imagine plant eating life? I mean, they can eat little bird, frogs, So this is sort of ultimate revenge. I mean, they have waited, they have huge patience, for millions of years. Then they came up with this, Venus flytrap. Side by side, this is a wonderful, again, symbiotic relationship between the flowers and the insect. Why there's a beautiful petals? Why the flower is so smell? Why do you see white flowers so, good smell? Not for us, not for your girlfriend, okay? Or why the flowers are so beautiful? Not for human. This is to attract insect. And mind you, there is a difference between insect and us. We only see 3 colors, RGB, red, green, and blue. Okay, so what we see flowers, oh, it's beautiful. But from insect eyes, they have this ultraviolet ray. They have 4 color vision. They see much detail. I mean, if you see the landing of insect on orchid, you'll be surprised. They have a sort of runway, and the insect just lands there and goes straight to this, nectar. So which we cannot. Okay, we don't have that. So they are attracting insects, and insects eat the honey and they go to the another flower. This is how the cross-pollination starts, And so this is a wonderful truce between the insects and flowers. But most of the time, they really fought. Still they're fighting. This is why they have thorns, they have drugs, they have poisons, just to deter, So it's a very interesting, as you said, it's a very interesting story. Tree has 2 life. One is, subterranean, why there's a beauty, because, fungi and tree, they have a sort of good friendly relationship almost for 300 million years and still going on. But as you come to the top part, then, there is always a sort of competition. And if plant didn't, develop all kinds of equipments, then they would not be here. They had to fight, and it is a sort of arms race. Okay, plants develop something, insect will develop something, to deter. And so it's a very interesting story. But so let me watch the movie, then maybe I'll be able to comment.
Oh. Well, thanks, Shankar. Thanks for balancing our conversation out. In The Hidden Life of Trees, Voleben has a chapter on the war of the trees and the insects, and as a caretaker considers insects the enemy, but he knows how effectively they can harass the trees. And so part of the discussion of the communication that we didn't really touch on was the defense mechanisms that have developed by which forests warn their members and prepare them to produce sort of anti-insect chemicals of various sorts. but you know, our friend Lynn Margulis would be the first to acknowledge that when she says, I don't want to say competition or cooperation, they're both too anthropomorphic. But granting that we fall back on these terms, that it's there's a vast spectrum but the end of the spectrum that's been kind of suppressed, I would say, by Darwinist and neo-Darwinist discourse is the mutualistic or cooperative end of the spectrum of living relationships. And now I think so, but we do want to keep things in balance. I'm very much looking forward to your panel next week because I like the science stuff. And of course that's, I just think this is the right place for us to begin this conversation, kind of get some science under our belt. And then we'll have plenty of time for all the other dynamics going on. But I should stop now and see, toss it back to Mike and see how we're doing.
Yeah, we've got some time for questions or comments. And the way we'd like to do that, if any of our attendees have questions or comments, is you'll notice on the bottom of your screen on the Zoom panel, there's a button that says Q&A. And you can type in a question or comment there, and I will deliver it back. I'll read it out loud so our panelists can hear, and they will speak on the microphone. While you're doing that, I actually have a question that came over email tonight ahead of time, and this is from Bill Corrigan, who is here as one of our attendees. And this is a good question. And it's a good question given and we have Dr. Chatterjee with us too, who's going to keep us honest on the science end of things tonight. And Bill's question was about the metaphorical language that we see in the documentary. So in Intelligent Trees, you hear this language about pain, about mothering, and Bill's question is about using metaphorical language in scientific work. And wondering, is it a matter of communicating scientific ideas to non-experts, or are the metaphors actually driving the scientific inquiry itself? And maybe we can talk about this. And he asks, if the latter is the case, can you think of an instance where image or metaphor helped drive the formation of a hypothesis? So again, the question is, we have this metaphorical language to describe scientific processes in the documentary. Is that just a case of making it accessible to us who are not scientists, or does the metaphor sometimes drive the scientific inquiry itself? And I'd be curious to hear what any of our panelists have to say about that. Yeah.
Hey, Curtis, Mike.
We'll let the poet answer.
I've got a lot to say about that. I think that metaphor drives everything that we do, right? I mean, this is how we understand how we can conceive the world, right? I mean, because it's so vast and because everything, we're not literal. We're always using metaphors. And I mean, Sankar, I'm not going to, I don't want to step into your field, but I immediately thought of the Big Bang, right? I mean, maybe there was a lot of noise, and that is touching on the explosion, but we don't necessarily think of the Big Bang as, oh, what must that have sounded like? Right? There's a whole lot of other stuff that's going on in there, and that's the figurative sense. And I don't know I doubt if that came from a poet. I think it came from a scientist. Right?
Who likes poetry.
Yeah, exactly.
Always. And metaphor is very powerful, Many of the important scientific concepts, they used in a metaphor.
Well, this, we've been looking at this question. We've been reading also Merlin Sheldrake's new book, Entangled Life, to get the fungal side of the story. And he's, and also Rob McFarlane in his book Underland has a chapter where he's talking to Sheldrake, and they're talking about the Wood Wide Web, and so what comes out in this conversation, well, here, let me back up just a sec to I try to answer the question straight on. Clearly, both of these are happening, and maybe the more obvious one is that the sort of family tropes are and the affective language of pain and fear and anxiety, and as well as care and concern. Yes, I mean, on the one hand, but I think what makes it different is it's not simply kind of sort of, it's not fantasy language. It's not like, it's not fairy tales. It's a translation of what we're coming to understand as the sort of hidden dynamics of the ways that these organisms live and the way that they live with each other. And so the metaphors are, I think, help a general audience to get a little closer to the science, because that's what they're really trying to talk about, the science. They're not just trying to humanize the forest so that we'll care about. Now with Sheldrake, especially in conversation with the nature writer Rob McFarlane, they're thinking about how metaphor, for instance, the metaphor of the marketplace, which comes up in the documentary and is all over, and sort of game theory is all over the neo-Darwinist discussion of evolution, and you know, what could be more human than game theory? And tropes of the marketplace and cost-benefit analyses. And so Sheldrake talks about, I think, people doing good science, but when they come to, he said, well, what I seem to see between the fungi and the trees is a sort of buy low, sell high barter arrangement going on there in the Wood Wide Web. And they're both saying, you know, or, you know, whether you bring in capitalist free market tropes or you bring in, like, you know, left-wing socialist communalist tropes of care and concern, you're still kind of forcing, the metaphors are driving the science, because you're still ending up with tropes, which I think Curtis would tell us, you know, it's like, well, there's some tropes are better than others, but it's not like we're going to get away from them. But in some purified language, you know, that dream is gone, as you know, over.
But there's a really important distinction here, Bruto, in what you're saying, and it has to do how you arrive at the metaphors. If you begin with the metaphor and you impose it upon what it is you're dealing with, the forest itself, then obviously it's the wrong direction. It is the fungi, it is the trees, it's what's happening underfoot that draws us or informs us of the potency of the metaphor to carry what it is we're trying to convey. And you really, I mean, that's fundamental. That's one of the key issues at play when we think about metaphor, and indeed about the relationship between the humanities and sciences. Because we're also talking about specific relationships between fungi and roots and trees. So in other words, in my language, specific relationships between objects, object-object relationships, right? The moment we're making that jump to the human relationship with the forest, now we're in the full realm of the humanities, and we're unleashed. So this kind of nuance here with the science is how you're led to the potency of the metaphor, how you come to it, and the research, and how it compels you to find that. It's fundamental.
You bet.
Can I give you some examples?
Go ahead.
Shankar, go ahead.
just two examples, which are very difficult to explain to public, but they used metaphor. For example, if I say boson particles, nobody will understand. It may be subatomic particles, but they came up with this idea, God's particle. And as soon as they use that in a term, it's so catchy. That means it's very elusive. It may be there, but we cannot detect. So that kind of metaphor is very strong. Similarly, life. Life is computational at its best. It's a complex algorithms. But if I tell you, you'll not really realize the complexity of life. But if I tell that there are three components of life, cell membrane, protein, and nucleic acid, and what's their function? If I say just like a computer, cell membrane is your casing, protein is your hardware, nucleic acid is your software. This simple metaphor really clarify even any people, oh, life is like that. So we have built-in computer, one is just like casing, one is just like hardware, protein, and one is software like nucleic acid. So metaphor is a very powerful tool, and it's often used in science. Of course, poet, you may explain better.
Well,
I was just going to add that I feel like Sara, what Sara was mentioning before about, language and metaphor, but also giving us, offering this different perspective. And I think that I'd like to hear what Sara has to say about this, thinking about an indigenous perspective of, we have to change our worldview to understand certain metaphors, right? It's easy for me to say, okay, well, here I am in the West in contemporary society, I'm going to do this. But if I'm translating something from, let's say, 18th century Spain, I have to understand a different perspective, right? But then there's a whole other worldview that I think Sara can talk about, and which I'm curious to see how you would answer this.
I would bring us right back to the documentary and remind us that as humans, we think through language, right? So I've heard linguists say, you don't speak your language speaks you. And what they mean, of course, is that what you can conceive of in the world is in no small part shaped by the words your language gives you to name and understand those things. And of the three main researchers in the documentary, only the indigenous salmon fishery scholar was unsurprised by all these new scientific discoveries, and so unsurprised that she said, well, yes, of course, not only have we known this for 13,000 years, but we have multiple words for it already in our language, and here they are. And she named off several words and phrases in several different indigenous languages, right? And Bruno points out that if we think of trees as communicating within their own networks and with fungal entities, and through fungal entities, they may use chemical signatures and various kinds of nutrients. For humans, right, we use words and language. And I think that part of what Western scientists have to do is struggle for metaphors, because we don't have words in our language the way that indigenous cultures might already have to help us think about these things. So we reach, right? We come up with new scientific terms, or we reach to those relationships that we feel most comfortable with, right? Our mothers, our siblings, our children.
Great. I see we've got a couple participant questions or comments.
Yeah. Can you see the questions there? I can read it out loud, but The first is from Carolyn Tate, who now lives in Bend, Eastern Oregon. And she writes, for the last week, we've been drowning in smoke from the forest fires on the west side of the Cascades. Vis-a-vis the current fires, you may have seen the stories of people trying to escape. After decades in the West, why do we allow people to live in these deep forests? The ancient Maya lived in forests, but as Charles Mann showed in his book 1491, they managed the forest intensively. Only recently has the U.S. Forest Service begun to incorporate advice from indigenous groups, which you know, really continues what Sara was telling us there about variable perspectives. And then we also have a comment here from Jacob Bow, who says, Boyben's book is called The Hidden Life of Trees, and the documentary is called Intelligent Trees, but there exists in both works a discussion of the forest. What exactly is a forest? It appears from Dr. Bauer's comments about a tree city that it is more than a group of trees. Are there different definitions and connotations for literature and for science? And I would say before our panelists enter the conversation, Dr. Spurgeon's comments in our podcast, which I would advise you all to listen to, respond to this very question about the separation between trees and the forest as eloquently. Forest is not a tree farm, but I'll let our panelists respond to both of these comments from the Q&A.
Hey, Carolyn.
Well, I would point out that Carolyn's observation was absolutely correct, that indigenous people have managed North American forests as well as Central and South American forests using a number of various techniques, including controlled burns, for many thousands of years. I believe I mentioned in my podcast researchers in California looking at redwood stumps and able to see in the tree rings when Europeans arrived and put a stop to local indigenous fire management regimes, and how the forests and the trees begin suffering. In Montreal and various parts of the North Woods, I'm from Minnesota, so that means anything north of the Twin Cities, indigenous people managed those forests with fires as well. And I know in Montreal, Europeans used to come out and watch the spectacle of the controlled burns that were used to create the park-like expanses that Europeans found so enchanting about the early forests. The thick, dense, brush-filled forests of today are relatively new, right? They would not have been the forests on this continent in 1491, to refer to Charles Manns's article and book. But it's not just in the Americas, right? Australia, of course, suffered through horrifying wildfires that have grown increasingly severe over the years, and have, at least according to indigenous folks, Aboriginal people in Australia, routinely ignored the Aboriginal forest management regimes, and are now, of course, paying the price in really terrible ways. So why we allow people to live in these dangerous forests that we've created is an excellent question, and I don't think that logic can fully answer it. Maybe.
No, well, who's gonna say they can't live their American lives anywhere they damn please? Lee Klinger's topic in November is exactly what we're talking about. And he's got hands-on experience. We're gonna be joined by Vicki Sutton here at Tech. Horn Professor of Law is gonna bring in some legal perspectives. and she also has an indigenous background and is going to speak especially at our conference at the end of the program, is going to bring a panel together on forest law, and so she's aware of the difficulty that the indigenous peoples have had being allowed to bring their practices back into effect. So yeah, I think this is a topic I don't really have a good answer for Carol, and it's great to see her here as part of this event. But I'm sure there are other folks can pick up this thread of discussion very effectively. Should I jump in on Jacob's? Jacob,
yes.
I mean, it's a good question, that why trees? Why is the title talk about trees, but sort of there's I don't know, is there a slippage there? I could just speculate that perhaps we identify with trees because we've had experience, we've probably had more experience with single trees than we've had with forests. A tree is this individual organism, and it might be, not part of a forest, but something in our suburban backyard. That was our arboreal experience. But forests are very much, I think, simply, it's when you've got enough trees to have a community, as opposed to just singletons and loners and transplants off on their own, just sort of making it without the connections that a forest makes possible.
Well, or Bruno, it could just simply be an issue of bandwidth. I mean, the main bandwidth of the movie was focused on the interaction between one or two trees and those around it. So the focus is an issue of scale, is proximity. When it drew all back to the kind of forest as a whole, of course, it was talking about it, that was kind of course, contextualizing it from the canopy down. But when we were dealing with it, and especially what was happening underfoot, it really was a kind of relationship that was right there and proximate. So perhaps that was it sounds like a debate that they themselves had. I would imagine that they did.
There was also the comment about the diversity, right? Where, when you've got a group of trees that are all the same tree, there's going to be a weakness, or there's going to develop a kind of sickness and inability to kind of really grow and expand. And again, thinking about that figurative parallel to humanity, we're stronger being more diverse, right? When you introduce, or when there are different species of trees in the same forest, it's going to be a stronger, more vigorous forest, and they're working with each other, right? Whereas, again, I go back to that image that is in my head of that tree farm, of these pine trees that are all in rows, and they're kind of sickly looking, right? So, yeah.
If I could just drop in one other way of expanding how we think about what might constitute a forest, that it doesn't always have to be a tree. So in Japan, where I lived for a year, bamboo grow 40 feet high. Technically, I believe, Sankar, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that they're actually a kind of grass, not a tree. And yet they are referred to as bamboo forests, and they have the kind of varied insect, bird, and fungal life and other things that you would expect in a forest, but they are not trees. And in Arizona, the same can be said for the saguaro cactus forests, right? They act like forests. The plants within them communicate in very large and single organisms. Often what we thought were individual creosote plants, scientists have now recently discovered are in fact one single plant, often covering many square miles. And saguaros seem to grow especially well in and around these creosote bushes. But saguaros are obviously a kind of cactus. They are not a tree, and yet they can still form a forest.
Okay, so
throw one other thing in there. I've heard that cotton is actually considered a tree. Right? I mean, could that be? I mean, imagine then we've got all this cotton forest around us.
I'm not sure. We've got Carolyn is followed up her comment with a fascinating observation, although horrifying because of it's having to do with these forest fires. She says, I saw smoke coming from the ground around a diseased tree. I found out that the ponderosas were communicating, trying to eliminate this weak member from their midst. So I don't know how they quite sort of pushed the fire over to like get rid of this, tree that was on the way out anyways. But if they, I mean, that I think, I'm just learning myself about so much of this topic, but and this connects to Stephanie Flanagan, who's got a really interesting question here that basically for 100, and Shankar, I think you could help us here, but my understanding is for hundreds of millions of years, there've been, forest fires are kind of, they've always been around. And the trees have just evolved to deal with them because they've got all the time, they're on tree time. So the fires don't, even before sort of wise tending practices emerged among indigenous populations, this would be a very recent phenomenon relative to there are trees that need fire in order to reproduce.
Yeah. And I just want to make comments. If you go to Yellowstone National Park, there's a beautiful sections, and you can count. There are at least 30 forest fires. They're recorded because it's sitting on a volcano. So this volcano would erupt, and so volcanoes and lightning, these are the two common things. And throughout geologic period, you see the forest fire. In Antarctica, we found a tree trunk inside is completely charcoal. So it's a very good example of forest fire. So Mother Nature also does these things, for better germination, clearing out, and so it is there. But this particular, fire in the West Coast, of course, partly we are the culprit. We did this global warming, and it really helped.
Sara pointed out already that there is an increase in combustible material below them. So, I know Big Basin Redwood State Park very well. Everybody tells you redwoods do very well with fires, but we've lost a lot of very old redwoods in this last fire. Big Basin has seen many that are, touching millennia fall. So they've been around a long time, but this is kind of a different thing. And Sankar is pointing that out in the context of climate change. But there was a lot of combustible material on the ground in ways that they hadn't seen or been around in a long time. And the shapes of those primordial forests, of course, were shaped by this, but they would have been very different in character from what we are dealing with now. So
one imagines the humidity would have just been generally higher, offering a certain dampness that would tamp down the destructiveness of fires. I mean, over these longer time periods that we're thinking about. And so I want to address Stefania's question, because she's referring to the Wohleben book. Well, no, I'm sorry, to his comments at the end of the documentary. Didn't Wohleben suggest humans leave the forests alone to manage themselves? And he certainly did say that. But at the same time, I took him to be saying, by and large, leave them intact, let them do their own thing, but we can still log them, thoughtfully. We can log them in a way that they're still productive and we get what we need, but we don't harm their basic, healthy state, which they can manage themselves. They can keep themselves healthy. That's what I took Wohleben to be saying there, because we need the forest. I mean, we need that. I mean, we just, they are a source of commodity.
Right. It'd be worth our time to go back and listen, see how the German word that was translated into management, because management is the wrong term. Trees don't have manos. They don't have hands. They don't handle. But it would be interesting just to see what term he actually used, because it could be an issue of translation.
We are coming up on 9 o'clock, and so I think it may be time to thank all of our panelists. I'm especially grateful to all of them sharing their time, Doctors Clarke, Bauer, Spurgeon, Witmore, and Chatterjee, who joined us tonight. Dr. Chatterjee will be back a week from tonight for our panel with TTU scientists on the evolution and ecology of forests. And so we encourage you, as I said at the top of the event tonight, to go to the Humanities Center website and register for that event if you haven't already. And just a quick thank you to the Humanities Center staff, Justin Hughes, Tara Akopi, and Callie Watson, one of our student workers who has patiently sat with me tonight, and you can see she was our extra tech support tonight, and I'm very grateful to have her with me to help out with that. Thanks so much to all of our panelists, and especially for all of you for putting together an incredible array of events for this semester, and we look forward to all of them.
Come on back.
Come to all of them this fall, yes.
Come to all, be part of our forest.
Thank you.
Okay.
It was enjoyable.
All right.
Yeah.
Success.
Yeah.
Thanks, team.
Great to
Bye-bye.
have a chat. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.